So let's talk about the black-clad winged bikers of the Dark Angels 2nd Company, with a review of the Dark Angels Ravenwing in 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Dark Angels once more, and in this video I thought we'd go over Ravenwing in the new Codex. In the video let's go over the lore of the Dark Angels 2nd Company briefly, a quick talk about some of their models, and then go through the full rules for their Company of Hunters detachment, a whole bunch of relevant Ravenwing units both from the Dark Angels Codex and Core Codex Space Marines, and a few other thoughts as to other units in the detachment, the possibility of using the Stormlance, and one idea for a kind of fun themed army list. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. In the lore, the Ravenwing are the 2nd Company of the Dark Angels, fighting in jet black armour and typically fight with mounted formations, usually bikes, land speeders and storm speeders with some flyer support. Compared with the 2nd Company of most Space Marine chapters, which tends to be a more standard balanced battle company, the Ravenwing therefore serve as a rapid assault force and recon force for the chapter, scouting out the enemy and hitting targets of opportunity very hard. Bikes so fast that they can jink through the fire of enemy shooting, deal heavy damage and escape before the inevitable retribution. Unbeknownst to a lot of the chapter, their secret purpose however is to monitor and hunt down members of the Fallen. Typically the Ravenwing might be sent to bring individual members of the Fallen to justice in an arrow swift strike, though if they needed more dedicated focused might to deliver a mailed punch to the foe, they might be able to call in the support of some teleporting 1st Company Deathwing. In the Indomitors era, some of the patterns of their units have been updated somewhat. Many of them fight with Outrider bikes and have been adopting the new Storm Speeders, though the inner circle elite of the company remain the Ravenwing Black Knights with true knowledge of what the company is aimed to do, and equipped with their fearsome Corvus hammers and plasma talons. For Ravenwing miniatures within Warhammer 40k, perhaps the single most central kits to the faction are the Ravenwing Black Knights, as you can see here with their stylized winged pinion armor plates that mount their plasma talons out the front, and the feathered back banner sort of thing that's kind of similar to the winged hussars. They can be built either as the more standard squad on the left, or the commanding Ravenwing command squad with the company champion, Ravenwing Ancient and Apothecary all on bikes. The Ravenwing are led by Samael at the front here on his jet bike Corvex, thought to be one of the last surviving Imperial jet bikes out there, outside of relics possessed by the Adeptus Custodes. Otherwise, they have the Landspeeder Vengeance that you can also build as the Ravenwing Dark Shroud, replacing the big plasma cannons for the icon to shield nearby Ravenwing from harm, and the two patterns of Ravenwing Fighter Jet, the Dark Talon with its Stasis Bomb and Rift Cannon versus the Nephilim Jet Fighter. It seems that with miniature updates, Games Workshop was focusing on the Deathwing release for 10th edition. My guess would be that in the 11th edition of the game they'll probably have a Dark Angels update that focuses on the Ravenwing to be a counterpoint to that, maybe with some Primaris scaling Black Knights. In terms of in-game strength, in 9th edition, for most of the edition it was more about the Deathwing. Big chunky Terminator stat lines that you could only wound on a 4+ were rather indomitable, but towards the end of the edition in Arcs of Omen, Ravenwing did get rather good. Lots of their units seemed play, perhaps particularly the Landspeeder Vengeance and the Black Knights. The Talon Master was certainly a key unit in 9th edition as well, though unfortunately that has been since removed. Sadly no more will his twin assault cannons and heavy bolters blaze away, safe from enemy reprisals with character protection. In early 10th edition, unfortunately Ravenwing armies have been fairly non-existent in the competitive side of the game, generally with Dark Angel lists using the core Codex Space Marine detachments. The most commonly played unique Dark Angels units tended to be Grandmaster Azrael and the Deathwing Knight Squad. For the Ravenwing, it seemed that people weren't too excited to put them on the table in optimised list. I did see the occasional Landspeeder Dark Shroud. I guess the durability buffs that gives are quite nice, and could be quite nice at the heart of a Space Marine tank formation, though I didn't really see it buffing any other Ravenwing really. Otherwise it seems that people in general have been considering the Black Knights and Outriders and Planes just to be a bit overcosted at the moment for what they do. You do kind of expect them to be charged at a premium for their speed, but it does look like their damage and defense aren't quite adding up at the moment. In Codex Dark Angels, for the current Ravenwing unit list, you'd be able to field these units. Given 3 different plastic kits with multi-build options, you've got the Black Knights and Ravenwing Command Squad, now with a character keyword, the Landspeeder Vengeance with its big plasma cannons and the Ravenwing Dark Shroud, the Dark Talon and the Jet Fighter for the Planes, and Grandmaster Samael. As mentioned, the Ravenwing Talon Master has been removed, which is kind of a shame as it was an interesting combination of synergy and firepower piece for several editions in the game. And as per the keyword section in the Dark Angels Codex, you also get to give the Ravenwing keywords to Outriders, the Invader ATV, the Chaplain on bike, and all Space Marine vehicles that get the Fly keyword as well, namely the Storm Speeders and Flyers. Broadly, the keyword is generally relevant for just the detachment-specific stratagems and enhancements, and not really much else. Speaking of that detachment though, in 10th edition you can play Ravenwing as the Company of Hunters. That's the dedicated detachment within Codex Dark Angels, and I'd rate this one alongside the Deathwing one as perhaps the two more interesting detachments of the Codex. Unfortunately, they really didn't make the Unforgiven task force very powerful, even if a few of the stratagems are handy. For the Company of Hunters, I'd say that the detachment rule is alright, and the enhancements can give you some massive alpha strikes. The stratagems perhaps just a little bit more so-so though. I guess this one might be competing against the Stormlance detachment for Ravenwing armies, and that could be another valid option. If we do stick with the book Company of Hunters detachment though, they have a core rule called Master of Maneuvers that applies to all Astartes units, allowing them to shoot in a turn when they advance or they fall back, though pretty much everything else in the detachment is locked to Ravenwing style units. So besides Armour of Contempt, you wouldn't really be getting anything else bar this rule. In general, I'd say this is a pretty good detachment rule though. Maybe not standout carries the entire game, but definitely a very usable one for literally any shooting unit. Advance and shoot, like in the Firestorm detachment, is just very handy to have. Sometimes it's going to make the difference between whether or not you can get line of sight or range onto an enemy target, or make the difference between whether or not you can tag an objective and still get to shoot. And fall back and shoot just gives you a lot more options for anything that does get locked up in combat, particularly big range damage dealers that maybe could stay in combat and fire with big guns never tire or pistol perhaps, but allowing them to fall back means they don't have to risk another round of melee if they don't kill what they were in melee with, and allows other enemy units to shoot at the unit that tags them. It is kind of interesting that it is entirely range focused though. Ravenwing do have some melee combat, though I guess not as much compared with, say, Deathwing. For their unique units, it does kind of feel like medium helpful on most of their unique stuff. The bikes and the speeders have good movement anyway, so maybe a little bit of diminishing returns in advancing and shooting stuff. For the Ravenwing Black Knights, it's pretty nice to be able to advance and still shoot, though it would stop you charging unless you have something like Samael or an enhancement, and Samael in particular already gets advanced shoot and charge, so he's not really gaining anything from this one. On the flip side, it does feel kind of weirdly good for slower firepower units. Maybe Eradicators seem to be one of the best winners of this rule, strangely enough. Advance and shoot is great to get that 18-inch range in range of targets that they can threaten, and then fall back and shoot means they can't just be tagged by chaff enemy infantry units to stop them firing next turn. Pretty scary to think that they're still going to be firing away with their melter guns until they're absolutely dead, even if the opponent has a nuisance unit to lock them up. Otherwise though, it does just seem helpful for things like dreadnoughts or big gun tanks. Faster movement and being able to fall back and shoot are both nice things to keep the gun line firing and efficient. The secondary core rule that the detachment grants is battle line outriders as well. This means that you could easily have an all-bike army for the Ravenwing if you really wanted to. You could get 6 units of outriders into here, each at 6 models and maybe even 7 theoretically with an extra ATV. Combine that with a Black Knight datasheet and you could put some serious amounts of bikes on the board. I do kind of like this rule as it's basically fielding the outriders like they're troops of the detachment, which feels appropriate for the Ravenwing. Though for it to actually add any strength at all to the detachment, you need to be running an army that actually wants to run 4+ units of Outriders, which really isn't the case for most Space Marine army lists right now. Outriders are just generally seen overcosted at the 95 points that they are at the moment. I feel like they need to come down in points cost fairly significantly from that to be really seen as properly competitive or anything. And even then, they might be a unit that you don't want absolutely tons of, given that they're kind of good against light infantry but not against heavier stuff. Still though, in this detachment they do get more support than most other places out there, and it does feel appropriate for them to be a core of this force. Moving on to stratagems though, and for the Company of Hunters they get Armour of Contempt, the standard worsen AP by -1. Always nice to have a reactive durability boost on the go, though the Ravenwing will have to weigh it up against higher speed's focus. Next up for 1 CP we've got Death on the Wind, which is a battle tactic. That grants a battle shock test to a unit that's just shot by a Ravenwing unit, -1 to the test if there's a Ravenwing unit within 6 inches of them. Unfortunately, this one is just bad unless they really change the rules for how battle shock works, just due to the opponent automatically healing it in their next command phase. For 1 CP, high speed focus is a -1 to hit for a Ravenwing unit in the shooting phase. Not a bad one to be able to access, particularly if you're being shot by an army that's majority ballistic skill 4. Sometimes it'll be the right choice to go for if you want extra durability, sometimes Armour of Contempt will be. This one is notably a lot less powerful than its equivalent in the Stormlance Force though, where their equivalent stratagem gives you -1 to hit and wound. For 1 CP, Talent Strike is a damage boost one where a Ravenwing mounted unit gets +1 to wound against infantry or mounted units with a character keyword, and that one can apply to shooting or fighting. I guess quite a lot of time against those specific targets they'd probably be wounding on a 4+ or better, meaning that it's not quite as powerful as if you could use it against a big heavy tank or vehicle character. Kind of situational, as not every enemy threat that you encounter will have the character keyword, but when it can trigger it could be a nice enough damage boost. Loads of plasma shots with +1 to wound is a good way of getting most things dead. For 1 CP, Rapid Reappraisal is a return to reserves option. A Ravenwing unit that's not in engagement range at the end of the enemy turn is allowed to return to reserve, and it comes back via strategic reserve in most circumstances in your next reinforcement phase. Again, I guess this one probably isn't one to use literally every turn, given that their position on the board might well be more valuable. The Ravenwing units, particularly with their advance and shoot, are going to be able to reach things really quite a long way away on the map, so hopping them off the board to guarantee just turning up 9 inches away might actually wind you up further away than their normal movement. Though for the right unit it could be a good choice, potentially if you wanted to just shift focus to the other side of the map. And the Ravenwing command squad can have a boosted charge out of strategic reserve, I guess. You'd have a +1 to charge, so we'll be getting it off on an 8. If you've got a command point reroll to spend at that point, then it could be at least somewhat reliable. Finally, for 1 CP, there's Hunter's Trail. This is a Ravenwing mounted unit one that can mark an objective as a sticky objective. Provided you've controlled it in the command phase, it will remain yours for the rest of the game, until your opponent takes it at the start or end of any turn. Again, this one maybe doesn't feel auto-used, but could be handy enough to have situationally. If you can make sure that your opponent can't get to that objective, it could mean that the unit that was holding it is allowed to move on and keep up the offensive. Theoretically, it could be kind of huge if you could just abandon an objective, presuming that you know that your opponent's got no way to reach it. Overall, I feel like the stratagems are kind of balanced, though maybe there's no real enormous standout ones here for me. The battle shot one seems pretty bad, everything else seems usable. -1 to hit will often be the right choice. The +1 to wound is great, but relies on you needing to target, say, an infantry or mounted character, which certainly isn't every unit out there. Returning to reserves is great, but it does conflict with their great movement that they already have. And the sticky objective, I'd say, is kind of situational. It definitely feels like there's a fair bit of theme to them, keeping the bike force moving and attacking from unexpected angles, and applying some pinpoint damage to enemy characters as they hunt the fallen, I guess. Otherwise, for the company's enhancements, they've got 3 interesting ones that could give you big alpha strikes on the enemy, and 1 small fight phase upgrade. As these ones are all locked to Ravenwing Keyword units, there's literally only 2 choices for units that can bear them, either the Chaplain on bike or the Ravenwing Command Squad, seeing as the champion now has the character keyword. First up, we've got Master of Maneuver. This one is 15 points printed in the Codex, and it allows the bearer's units to start in strategic reserve without counting towards the points limits, and arrive from strategic reserve on turn 1, or arrive from anywhere from strategic reserve including the enemy's deployment zone if you turn up on turn 2. A kind of intimidating way to get the alpha strike on the outskirts of the enemy army, depending on how well they can screen. You could potentially have this on a command squad on a very big unit of Black Knights and just fire an enormous amount of plasma shots into whatever you can turn up just outside of 9 inches from. And then the command squad could give you a +1 to charge, so it could be an 8-inch charge there, maybe re-rolling with a CP for a 66% chance to succeed. This one does look like it would work with rapid ingress if you could safely deploy the big unit without any enemies being able to very seriously damage them. And potentially you could combine this one with the stratagem to take the unit off the board again, if say you arrived from strategic reserve turn 1, did an alpha strike on the enemy units, and then after the enemy turn you could ping them off the board again for 1 CP and turn up in the opponent's backfield unless they're able to screen it. Quite a lot of good options, and I think for 15 points it seems fine enough to me. Pretty much does guarantee a shooting alpha strike on something. It maybe does conflict a bit with the core detachment rule though, with the advance and shoot, or the good movement profiles that you're just not really using. Otherwise, for 10 points, there's a mastercrafted weapon, allowing a Ravenwing model to gain precision in melee. Given the units that this can be taken on, it just seems a bit situational really. With a full round of combat from the Ravenwing champion, you still have to roll kind of well to kill any one enemy support character. I'd say that this one is just one to take as a points filler if there aren't points that allow anything else. Next, there's Mounted Strategist for 30 points. This one allows your units to advance and charge and fall back and charge. Kind of gives you a second Samael that you could take with the Chaplain on bike or the Command Squad. This one does seem pretty great at getting another unit to Alpha Strike, means that you could be having 12 plus d6 inches movement with the Black Knights, or just a flat 18-inch move with an Outrider squad given their special rule, and then do a 1-2 punch with all their shooting maximally and then all their combat maximally. Quite a lot of damage there all in all. It is a bit of a pricey one though. Finally, for 20 points, there's Recon Hunter. This one gives the bearer's unit Scout 9 inches. Again, pretty excellent for setting up a first turn charge there. If you get first turn Scout 9 inch forward, with another 12 inches, you get to 21 inches, so you could easily be charging straight into the enemy's deployment zone, potentially at +1 to charge with a Ravenwing command squad. If you don't go first, you could perhaps use it to remain safe. You could use it to push the unit into the midfield behind a big ruin or something to stave off a bit of firepower. And to make this one a bit more effective, it's probably worth having at least some infiltrators in the list, maybe a unit of scouts in the midfield, as if the opponent moves their scouts into position or has infiltrators in the midfield to block them like some Nurglings or something, the unit might be a bit sad with its scout move and not be able to move up the board if it wants to. Overall though, it is kind of cool that this gives you basically 3 different ways to get a big alpha strike on the enemy: a first turn reserve, a massive threat range with advance and charge, and a big pre-game move with a Recon Hunter. You could potentially have a ridiculous amount of bikes hit the enemy army right from turn 1 if you want. Overall, I think it's an interesting enough detachment. The core rule is good, most of the stratagems are usable, if not as standout as some I think, and the enhancements are very nice. A Ravenwing command squad leading some big massed up units with the Alpha Strike style ones does seem fun. Getting onto the Ravenwing unit roster though, and we'll start out with the core Black Knight. They're 110 points per 3 or 220 at time of recording. They could easily change in the balanced data slate though. They're bikers with 3 wounds at toughness 5, and they get a 5+ invulnerable save to represent their Jinx sort of special rule they get. It means the unique Ravenwing models are just a bit more resilient against Melter or very high AP things. Their big threat are their Plasma Talons, where they get 2 shots out to 18-inch range at standard sort of plasma profile, then an extra shot with rapid fire at 9. They do seem like a great unit to make use of the detachment rule given their short range and wanting to get up close and personal with the enemy. Otherwise, in combat, they fight with relic weapons that are strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1. Not bad at killing infantry, but aren't going to punch up too much, though they do have a rule that rounds them out a little bit on the charge, getting anti-monster and anti-vehicle 4+ when they charge into combat, which does mean they should at least stack some wounds on monsters or vehicles, but they're kind of unlikely to actually wipe one out in combat just alone. They'd have to soften it up with their plasma weapons first. Kind of nice that the wounding on 4+ thing does help out attached characters though. Overall, for 110 points, they may be a little bit on the fragile side, though are fairly dangerous. They do feel like a unit where Games Workshop needs to get the points cost right if Ravenwing are going to get good. In the Codex, the Ravenwing Command Squad got pivoted to be a unit to lead the Black Knights. You get 3 bikers here that can attach to a Black Knight or Outrider squad. These guys get 4 wounds and the 5+ invulnerable save, and just have a lot of interesting things going on for their 130 points that they were pre-Codex. They get the Plasma Talons to shoot down some enemies. 2 of them get the standard Black Knight combat weapons, and the champion gets a master-crafted power weapon for a bunch of accurate attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2. And then they get quite a lot of helpful bonuses. The Apothecary can resurrect 1 slain model per turn outside of characters and ATVs. The banner helps out the unit's objective control, giving a maxed out unit a theoretical 27 OC, which is pretty big, and makes them more resilient to battle shock. And the Ravenwing champion has the character keywords to get enhancements, and also +1 to advance and charge, both of which are really useful in this detachment. The +1 to charge out of reserve, and the +1 to advance just with the core special rule. Overall, I think they just provide a massive amount of value to the squad, as well as just increasing the size of the squad full stop with 3 extra bodies. Seem like a pretty awesome unit to be bearing enhancements to me. Otherwise, for the land speeders, the Dark Shroud is 125 points, 10 wounds at toughness 8 with a 5+ invulnerable save, getting an assault cannon to fire with, and this one has an icon of Old Caliban to give units within 6 inches the benefit of cover and stealth for a -1 to hit. I feel like for Dark Angel's armies, the choice is probably to take 1 or none of these. You'd have some big diminishing returns on more than 1. It's only really any good against ranged firepower armies, so it isn't going to help you out against armies that go all in for melee. But I guess if you are in the right meta where you know you're going to be fighting off against a lot of things with guns, could be useful enough. It perhaps weirdly does seem to be more helpful with big tanky things like say Dreadnoughts with 2+ saves though, compared with some of the actual Ravenwing units. At 125 points though, seems usable enough to have one in the midst of a formation, and then have it go off to be a nuisance unit late game. The Landspeeder Vengeance lost a pip of damage on its big Plasma Storm battery, where on the overcharge it's now d6 +1 shots at strength 9, AP 3 and damage 2 twin linked. This did feel like a bit of a swing and miss for Games Workshop. Don't really know why they had to nerf this one. It felt like kind of appropriate for the big profile of the gun. As a result, at 160 points it would have to go down significantly to be good, maybe to the tune of 120 points or less perhaps. Its special rule is to try and get vengeance for an Adeptus Astartes unit killed within 6 inches of it, potentially meaning if you had multiple you'd be guaranteed to get a little bit of damage in the enemy turn if it's lost firepower to shooting, but perhaps feels more like a nice to have. Otherwise, for the planes, the Dark Talon's got quite a nice general purpose damage profile, a big strength 16 rift cannon and a bunch of twin-linked hurricane bolter fire to whittle down hordes, plus the stasis bomb has genuinely got a powerful special rule, preventing enemy fallback or forcing them to remain stationary outright if it can reach something. Definitely a bit light on the defensive side though, and in general doesn't really seem to be played at 210 points, again would need to drop in cost a bit. The Nephilim jet fighter again has okay damage stats in my opinion, 2 las cannons, a twin heavy bolter, and black sword missiles, plus a little bit more toughness than Sunfly's, -1 to hit and then -1 to wound if the thing that's shooting it can fly. Again, I want to see it at less than 195 points for it to get good though. Finally, for unique Ravenwing units, we've got Samael at 130 points. He can lead either the Outriders or the Black Knights, comes with a fairly chunky jet bike with a plasma cannon built in and a bunch of strength 6, AP 3 and damage 2 on the Raven sword with sustained hits too. His special rules are allowing you to shoot and charge when you're advanced, and then if you can tag an enemy unit that doesn't want to be in combat, you can force desperate escape tests on them, which is at least fairly powerful. I feel like if he does remain 130 points the same as the command squad though, I feel like the command squad just brings more weight and overall utility to say a big Black Knight unit, plus the ability to bear enhancements if relevant. His special rule does have a bit of overlap with the detachment special rules though, part of it being redundant in either the Ravenwing one or in Stormlance. Overall I feel like he'll be worth it if he's costed quite significantly less than the Ravenwing command squad. For the more generic datasheets we have the Outriders that you can take 6 of in the detachment. As mentioned earlier, 95 points is a bit too much for these guys, particularly when they've got things like the jump intercessors to compete with them with power fists. Their core rule is an automatic 6-inch advance, which could be kind of fun with the advance and charge option. You could advance, shoot and charge with these guys at 18 inches, which is nice, and you can take an Invader ATV for a little bit more ranged punch. A little bit on the overcosted side, but could be kind of fun for a slightly cheaper unit with 4 wounds rather than 3 for the Black Knights. Their main weakness is all their main damage output being strength 4 and AP -1 damage 1 though, and that only threatens certain things in game. The Invader ATV is 70 points at time of recording for a toughness 5 8 wound vehicle. Maybe not too bad as a very cheap expendable threat. It certainly feels like this detachment is perhaps one of the best for ATVs. Allowing it to advance and shoot could be good for getting that multi-melter within range, and if it is on the front lines being an expendable Outrider it certainly could get tagged in combat, so fallback and shoot is pretty good as well. You can also get to fire out of sequence against an enemy unit that just shot a mounted unit nearby. I feel like between all that, it's genuinely probably about as strong here as anywhere else. I'd say that it's overcosted for most Space Marines out there at 70 points. I wouldn't be too surprised if Games Workshop puts the points cost down on it a little bit, and that could make it a genuinely interesting nuisance unit here. Otherwise, the Chaplain on Bike is 75 points, interesting here as it's one of the only other units that can bear enhancements. He can give the unit that he leads a +1 to wound in combat, pivoting the Black Knights into a bit more of a melee-focused unit. Strength 5 and AP -2 is a lot more threatening if you +1 to wound, I guess. He also gives devastating wounds in the shooting phase against one unit within 12 inches, which definitely isn't unhelpful on Plasma. Could go through a few more armor saves, even though their AP3 is kind of good at that already. Overall, I would say that the Ravenwing command squad adds fairly significantly more, but they also cost significantly more as well, so it could be quite nice for a cheap bearer of an enhancement rather than a more expensive one. Otherwise, within Codex Space Marines, we've got the Storm Speeders. The Hellstrike is 130 points, does anti-infantry things, and gives you a special rule for extra AP in the shooting phase against things that aren't vehicles or monsters. Not awful, but that special rule being limited just limits the utility of this guy, I think. Again, probably a touch overcosted for what he does, given that he's only useful against certain units that he fires at. The Stormspeeder Thunderstrike though I'm a fair bit more positive on. A fair bit of anti-tank hitting on a 2+, and his rule gives you a +1 to wound against vehicles or monster units. Feels like that could really round out Black Knight units out there. A +1 to wound with strength 8 plasma is going to mean that you're wounding even toughness 12 and things on a 4+, and at AP3 damage 2 you're going to take down some vehicles pretty easily with that. Feels like he could be good support for the Ravenwing, and the detachment rules and the stratagems certainly help him out a bit as well. The Stormspeeder Hammer Strike has sort of anti-elite shooting with strength 9 and he strips cover. I'd say overall probably a little bit less overwhelming than the Thunderstrike for me, still not unusable though. Finally, for the core codex, we've got the planes, the Stormhawk and the Storm Talon gunship. I feel like are kind of similar and perhaps don't gain as much from the detachment. I'm maybe a little bit more enthused about the Storm Raven gunship maybe. Feels just a bit better and well rounded with some actually threatening firepower and -1 damage for enemies that try and shoot it. Could drop off a threatening firepower unit like perhaps Eradicators or something kind of close. Probably the best of the 3 core book flyers in my opinion. Otherwise, as mentioned earlier, the detachment rule definitely seems very nice for supporting just about any ranged unit out there. Advance and shoot gets you easier range and line of sight, and perhaps can make the difference between getting to objectives or secondaries or something. And fall back and shoot means that if the enemy tags you in close combat, big heavy hitter units can fall back and get to safety while not compromising on their firepower. Just about anything with a big gun will do really quite nicely with both of those. The gladiator tanks will like extra mobility and might be able to play a bit more aggressively on the front line if they're not going to fear being locked up. Maybe the Gladiator Valiant could come off particularly well with that, as could the Vindicator. And land raids and repulsors might not want the advanced rule as much, not if they're dropping their cargo after they've moved, but they would quite like the fallback rule just to give them a bit more flexibility, as they are the sort of things that might get charged on the front lines. All of those could certainly fire in combat with big guns never tire, but often that's not really what you want to do compared with falling back and shooting, as it means that you could target things without the -1 to hit. Other things can target the unit that you are locked in melee with, and also it means that you're safe from any sort of reprisals in the fight phase. Otherwise, just about every ranged infantry unit at least gets some value. Inceptors could potentially get charged as they drop so close, and then they could target something else rather than just relying on pistols. Eradicators, as mentioned, feel like they're perhaps one of the best synergies with the rule, both close range and might get locked up. The same for Infernus Marines against more infantry. Hellblasters already have assaults, though falling back and shooting would be quite nice. If Azrael's leading a unit of those, it would be nice to have their damage guarantees. Centurions and the Firestrike turrets would certainly like the advance, given their tiny movement characteristic, and there's plenty more. Finally, I guess the objective securing units might be handy if you were doing actions and things with them. The eligibility to shoot is kind of nice after you're either advancing and falling back, so it could mean that you could do things like deploying teleport homers or cleansing and things. Besides the Company of Hunters rules, there's also the option to run the Ravenwing as the Stormlance Task Force, essentially the White Scars themed one from Codex Space Marines. And if you wanted to run Ravenwing with a heavier melee focus, this seems like a pretty good way to do so. Again, it targets everything to bikes and fly vehicles, has a fair bit of overlap with the types of stratagems, and gives you the nice advance and charge special rule and fall back and charge, so maybe a bit more suited to delivering the melee compared with the plasma fire. The stratagems I think do give really good support for mounted units, 1 CP for a reactive move of 6 inches, a really nice defensive debuff for -1 to hit and wound for a mounted or fly vehicle unit being shot. I think that one's nice. 1 CP for advance and shoot, which will be really good with a big unit of Black Knights closing in. 1 CP for reroll charges and lance melee, again could be meaningful for strength 5 and damage 2 attacks. And a big one for 2 CP with auto advancing 9 inches for a mounted unit. That could give you a very long charge if you needed it in a pinch. Otherwise, they also have a copy of that enhancement for first turn strategic reserves, this one for just 10 points, again good for getting the Alpha Strike, plus other ones for fall back and shoot, a melee damage buff, and reroll advanced rolls, though I feel like perhaps the big strength of this detachment is in the stratagems. Overall, I feel like it's probably kind of similar strength to the Company of Hunters for the Ravenwing. They don't have quite as many melee units, which is probably the main thing that turns me off it a little bit, but some of the boosts are really nice. The 1 CP for -1 to hit and wound is great, reactive moves are great, and a few of the other options overlap. Finally though, and going back to the Ravenwing Dark Angels detachment, here's just one rough idea for a theme list for the army. At time of recording we still don't have the Minotaur and Field Manual points out for the Ravenwing units, so we don't know how much they're going to change. This is based on the pre-Codex points costs, so you might get a little bit of wiggle room to either go up or down. It's probably, if anything, over-investing in their unique biker unit, having no less than 27 Black Knight bodies on the board, 3 copies of the Ravenwing Command Squad with 1 each of the Alpha Strike options on the go, the Master of Maneuver for first turn reserves, Mounted Strategist for advance and charge, and Recon Hunter for the scout move. Should hopefully be able to deliver a fairly fantastic amount of plasma fire, backed up by a whole bunch of strength 5 melee, potentially right from turn 1. Then the rest of the list is in support and hoping to help out a little bit against armoured targets. There's a unit of scouts to hold the midfield and hopefully screen any enemy units that want to block the scout moving Ravenwing Black Knight units. A Landspeeder Dark Shrouds to hopefully try and lessen casualties on the enemy reprisal. A unit of 3 Outriders that could be a choice to mark some of the midfield objectives with the sticky objectives type rule. 2 units of 3 Eradicators that could either go in strategic reserve or be a bit of a counterpunch sort of unit. Advance and shoot and fall back and shoot is just generally nice to have, and they could repel any enemy armoured threats moving forward. 1 unit of 5 Infiltrators to take the backfield objective and use their Deep Strike screening rule to stop anything else getting close. And then just a little bit of vehicle support with a Stormspeeder Thunderstrike to give you +1 to wound with all of that Plasma Talon fire when you need it. A Gladiator Lancer for just a bit of random anti-tank firepower, but also a threat that's big enough that the enemy can't really ignore it. Could be zipping around quite quickly with its advance and shoot as well. It's maybe a little bit spammy, and I feel like if the enemy manages to hide units or screen out alpha striking, then it could be in big trouble very quickly. Hopefully with this many biker bodies though, plus a Dark Shroud to keep some of them safe, they should be able to just dominate one flank if that's what's required, and make some pretty efficient use of the supporting stratagems with these really big scary units. At their current points cost, I'd probably be a bit hesitant about the other land speeders and flyers perhaps, though obviously if they were to go down significantly, I'd be a lot more tempted to run them. In any case though, let me know what you think of the second company of the Dark Angels right now. How would you rate the company of Hunters, and could you see a force of them hitting the table for you anytime soon? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.